My name is Elellanar Whitmore, and before I tell you what happened to me, I need you to understand something. In the year 1856, a woman like me was not supposed to be loved, not truly, not fully, not in the way every lonely heart prays to be loved when the candles are out and the doors are closed and the truth is too heavy to speak aloud. I was 22 years old, born into a wealthy Virginia family, raised with all the manners and education expected of a proper Southern lady, and yet I was spoken of as if I were already half buried. Men did not look at me and see a future. They looked at me and saw an inconvenience, a defect, a lifetime of embarrassment wrapped in silk and seated in a mahogany wheelchair. They said I was too broken to marry, too fragile to mother children, too burdensome to manage a home, too unfortunate to be desired. And after 12 men turned me away, each one with a different cruelty dressed up as reason, I began to believe them. But then my father did something so shocking, so unthinkable, so dangerous that if anyone had whispered it aloud in polite society, they would have called him mad. He gave me to an enslaved man, a blacksmith, a giant of a man everyone feared. A man they called the Brute, and what began as an arrangement born of desperation became the greatest love of my life. So before this story begins, do me one favor. If you believe the world has always judged too quickly, if you believe the human heart can still surprise us, subscribe now, because what I am about to tell you is not just a love story. It is a story about what happens when the world labels two people as unwanted and heaven decides otherwise. I was 8 years old when the accident happened. Even after all those years, I could still hear the horse screaming. I could still feel the violent snap of my small body thrown from the saddle and onto the ground with a force that seemed to split my life into two clean pieces, before and after. Before I ran through the Whitmore estate in soft slippers and climbed staircases 2 at a time and believed my body belonged to me. After I lay in bed for months, feverish and aching, while doctors came and went with grave expressions and whispered in hallways as if I could not hear them. They prodded my legs, pinched my skin, held mirrors to my motherless face and spoke to my father in the language of pity. By the end of that winter, the verdict was clear. I would never walk again. My father ordered a mahogany wheelchair from Richmond, polished and beautiful, as if fine wood might make tragedy less visible. It arrived with brass fittings and soft cushions and the quiet finality of a coffin lid closing. From that day on, every room changed shape around me. At first, everyone treated me with tenderness. Servants lifted me with care. My father sat beside me in the evenings and read aloud from books he thought might comfort me. Visiting ladies stroked my hair and called me brave. But tenderness is a season, not a climate. It passes. What came after was worse. I grew old enough to understand glances, old enough to see the way people's mouths tightened when I entered a room, old enough to know when I was being discussed as a problem rather than a person. Girls my age were taught music, sewing, etiquette, flirtation. I was taught patience, resignation, gratitude for crumbs. Everyone assumed my future had ended before it began. No one said it plainly when I was young, but I understood. A daughter who could not walk was a daughter whose prospects had narrowed to almost nothing. As I entered womanhood, that truth sharpened like a blade. By the time I was 16, I had learned how to make other people comfortable with my existence. I smiled before they had to pity me. I spoke lightly before they could grow solemn. I mastered conversation, literature, and household accounts because the mind was the only territory no one had managed to take from me. But inside, I was starving. I do not mean for food or luxury. I mean for ordinary dignity, for the right to be seen as whole. I watched girls I had grown up with marry men they did not love but could at least tolerate. I watched them become mistresses of households, mothers of children, women with recognized places in society. And I remained where I had always been, in the drawing room by the window, beautifully dressed and quietly excluded from the life everyone else seemed to enter without effort. Then my father began arranging meetings. He never said it harshly. My father was not a cruel man by instinct, though he was very much a man of his time, and his world had taught him strange and terrible things. He believed marriage might still save me if only the right bargain could be made. So he invited eligible men to dine, to visit, to stay for weekends at the estate. Some were younger sons in need of money. Some were widowers. Some were ambitious men with land too small and appetites too large. Every one of them understood why they had come. They were not visiting because they admired my wit or wished to hear my opinions on poetry. They came to inspect the crippled daughter of Colonel Richard Whitmore and calculate what degree of discomfort they might endure in exchange for financial reward. I remember every one of them. The first was a red-haired lawyer from Fredericksburg who spoke to my father more than to me and asked the housemaid, while I sat 6 feet away, whether I could climb stairs if assisted. The second had kind eyes but a weak spine and let his mother make the decision for him. She decided I would be too taxing. The third smiled in my face and later said he could not imagine explaining me to his future business associates. The fourth said marriage required a robust wife. The fifth worried aloud about my constitution. The sixth asked whether my condition affected fertility. The seventh suggested that perhaps companionship without formal marriage might be more practical. The eighth looked visibly repulsed when my servant adjusted the blanket over my legs. The ninth feared scandal. The 10th feared inconvenience. The 11th wanted more money than my father was willing to offer. And the 12th, William Foster, 50 years old and permanently smelling of whiskey and stale arrogance, rejected me even after my father offered him a third of our estate's annual profits. That last rejection did something inside me. Until then, some foolish ember had remained alive. Some humiliating little flame that still believed if I were intelligent enough, gracious enough, beautiful enough from the waist up, perhaps one man might see me as more than damaged goods. But when even William Foster refused me, I understood my market value with brutal clarity. A woman who could not stand was worth less, in the marriage calculus of Virginia, than a drunk old man who slobbered into his supper. What stung most were not the rejections themselves, it was the language that followed them. She cannot walk down the aisle, she cannot keep up with children, she cannot manage servants properly, she cannot perform a wife's duties, she cannot be depended upon, she is delicate, she is incomplete, she is a burden. One rumor spread with particular viciousness, started by some physician who had never examined me and yet felt entitled to speculate that my injury had made me barren. Soon I was not merely disabled, I was defective in every way society considered useful. Men who had once at least pretended courtesy now treated me like damaged porcelain no one wanted to purchase. If this story has ever happened in a different form in your own life, if anyone has ever made you feel unworthy because of something you could not change, press like and leave a comment. I mean that sincerely, because the deepest wounds are often not physical. They are the names people give you until you start calling yourself by them in the dark. After Foster left, my father stopped pretending optimism. He called me into his study one grey afternoon in March of 1856. His study smelled of leather, tobacco, and old paper. It was the room where all serious decisions in our household were made. I rolled myself in with unusual dread. My father stood by the fireplace with one hand braced against the mantel, looking older than I had ever seen him. "No white man will marry you," he said. He did not soften it. He did not circle around it. He simply laid the sentence between us like an execution order. I stared at him. I had thought those words often enough in my own mind, but hearing them aloud was different. Hearing a parent confirm your greatest fear strips the flesh from it. There is no comforting lie left after that. He continued, "When I die, this estate passes to your cousin Robert. Virginia law will not leave it in your control, not independently. And Robert will not keep this house as it is. He will sell land, sell assets, reduce expenses. He will give you an allowance, no doubt, but you will live at the mercy of relatives who see you as an obligation." "Then leave me what you can," I said, "enough to manage." His eyes flicked to my chair, then away. "You know the law, and even if I structured something more generous, men like Robert would contest it. A woman in your condition cannot easily defend herself in court or commerce." There it was again, my condition, not my mind, not my will, not my name, my condition. "Then what do you suggest?" I asked, already weary. He turned fully toward me. "I am giving you to Josiah." For one moment I thought I had misheard him. My father was known for decisiveness, not madness, and yet madness was the only explanation that made any sense. "To whom?" "Josiah, the blacksmith." I laughed, not because it was funny, but because some part of me refused to accept the shape of the sentence. "Father, Josiah is enslaved." "Yes," he said, "I know exactly what I am saying." I remembered the silence that followed. It was not empty silence, it was thunder held in the chest. I knew who Josiah was, of course. Everyone on the estate knew him. He worked at the forge from dawn until twilight, his hammer ringing out across the property like a second heartbeat. People spoke of him in half fear, half fascination. He was enormous, taller than any man I had ever seen, broad as a doorway, powerful enough to bend metal with his hands. White guests whispered about him the way people whisper about storms. The women pretended not to look. The men made jokes too sharp to be harmless. The enslaved workers gave him a wide berth, not because he was cruel, but because he looked as though cruelty would be effortless for him. They called him the brute. And my father intended to make him my husband. Not legally, of course. Virginia would never recognize such a thing, but socially, privately, practically, he intended to attach me to Josiah for protection, support, and permanence. I said the first thing that came to me, "Have you asked him?" My father blinked. as though I had introduced a new and inconvenient dimension to the problem. "Not yet," he admitted. "I wish to speak with you first." That answer told me everything. My father was still a man shaped by ownership. He was not asking whether this was morally right. He was asking whether it was workable. In his mind, he was making an arrangement, not creating a life. And if I refuse, then I keep searching for another solution, while knowing there likely isn't one. He looked exhausted, more than exhausted, defeated. For the first time in years, I saw not the commanding Colonel Whitmore, but a father terrified of what would happen to his daughter after he was gone. "May I speak to him?" I asked, alone. He hesitated, not because he feared scandal, but because the very notion of private conversation between me and an enslaved man was beyond the habits of his world. "Yes," he said at last, "tomorrow." I did not sleep that night. I lay awake listening to the old house settle around me, thinking of all the humiliations my life had already contained and wondering whether this new one would be the final blow. Marry a man because no one else would have me. Marry a man whose freedom did not even belong to him. Marry not for love, not for companionship, not even for social appearance, but as a legal loophole in flesh. I felt horror, yes. But I also felt curiosity, and that honesty shames me less now than it once did. Because even then, before I truly knew him, some instinct in me resisted the way everyone else spoke of him. I had seen him from a distance enough times to notice what others did not, that he moved carefully around children, that he repaired tools for elderly workers without complaint, that he lowered his gaze not from stupidity but restraint. There was something about him that did not fit the story people told. The next morning, they brought him to the house. I was in the parlor near the window when I heard the heavy tread in the hallway. Then the door opened and my father entered first. Behind him came Josiah, and my first foolish thought was that he seemed too large to belong indoors. He had to duck beneath the frame. His shoulders looked capable of carrying walls. His hands, scarred from years of labor, hung at his sides with unnatural stillness, as if he had trained himself never to move more than necessary in white spaces. He wore a clean but plain shirt, rough trousers, boots blackened by forged soot. His beard was trimmed. His face was stern in structure yet strangely uncertain in expression, the face of a man who had been taught to make himself smaller than his body allowed. And then he glanced at me. Only a glance, brief, almost accidental, but in that moment I saw his eyes clearly. They were not hard, they were not wild, they were soft, intelligent, and deeply cautious. "Josiah," my father said, "this is my daughter, Elellanar." "Yes, sir," he replied. His voice startled me more than his size. It was low and resonant, but gentle, a voice that belonged reading poetry by lamplight rather than standing over a forge with sparks flying. My father made the necessary explanation in the language of arrangements. Josiah understood he would be responsible for my care. He understood his position would change. He understood certain expectations. The entire conversation felt obscene in its practicality, as though we were discussing property transfers rather than souls. When my father finally left us alone, the silence between us was nearly unbearable. "You may sit," I said at last. Josiah looked at the upholstered chair, then at me. "I don't think it would survive me, miss." Despite myself, I almost smiled. Then the sofa. He sat on the edge of it as if afraid to crease the fabric. Even seated, he seemed to fill the room. His hands rested on his knees, and I noticed burn marks across the knuckles, calluses layered thick as old bark, old scars pale against dark skin. Those were not the hands of a brute. They were the hands of a man who had worked too hard for too long. "Do you understand what my father proposes?" I asked. "Yes, miss. And do you want it?" He looked genuinely confused by the question. "What I want doesn't usually matter." The truth of that hit me like cold water. I had come into the conversation expecting awkwardness, perhaps resentment, perhaps fear. I had not expected that level of naked honesty. "It matters now," I said quietly, "at least to me." He was silent for several seconds, then he lifted his eyes to mine fully for the first time. "I don't know what to want, miss." That answer, too, was devastating. I asked him whether he was dangerous. He said no. I asked whether he was cruel. He said no. I asked whether he would hurt me. His expression changed then, not offended exactly, but pained. "Never," he said, "I swear it." There was such conviction in those two words that some knot inside me loosened. Then on impulse I asked, "Can you read?" Fear flashed across his face so swiftly I almost regretted it. Literacy was forbidden to enslaved people in Virginia, but after a long pause he answered, "Yes, miss. What do you read?" "Whatever I can find." The words came slowly at first, then with growing life. Newspapers, discarded pages, books borrowed in secret, old volumes from our neglected shelves. He had taught himself, not perfectly, not formally, but stubbornly. He read because he could not bear not to. "Have you read Shakespeare?" I asked. His whole face changed. There are moments in life when another person steps out from behind the mask society nailed onto them. That was one of them. Suddenly, the wary, careful blacksmith disappeared, and a man with a mind like open flame emerged in his place. "Yes, miss," he said almost breathlessly. "The Tempest, Hamlet, Romeo and Juliet." "Which is your favorite?" "The Tempest," he said at once, "because everybody says Caliban is the monster, but when you read closely you see what happened to him. His island taken, his life claimed, his humanity denied. They call him savage while stealing everything from him." I stared at him. He realized he had said too much and lowered his head again. "Sorry, miss." "No," I whispered, "go on." "So he did." For 2 hours we spoke about books, about language, about whether power makes monsters or only reveals them, about freedom as an idea and as a deprivation. He spoke with the intensity of a man who had been starved and suddenly allowed to eat. He had not read widely in the formal sense, but what he had read deeply. Every line seemed to have passed through his suffering and come out transformed into understanding. He was not polished, he was not trained, but he was brilliant. And when our conversation ended, I knew with absolute certainty that whatever happened next, I would never again be able to see him through the eyes of people who called him brute. "I do not think you are a monster," I told him. His throat moved. "Thank you, miss." "And when we are alone," I said, surprising even myself, "you may call me Elellanar." His eyes widened. "I shouldn't." "Nothing about this is proper," I said. "If we are to endure it, let us at least endure it honestly." He repeated my name softly, as if testing whether he had a right to touch it. "Elellanar." No man had ever said my name like that, not with reverence, not with care, not as though it belonged to a person instead of a problem. Then he said something I would remember for the rest of my life. "You are not unmarriageable. The men who rejected you are fools." That was the moment everything began. If you are still with me, subscribe now, because the world had already written both of us off by this point, and yet the most important chapter had not even opened. The arrangement became formal on the first day of April 1856. There was no legal marriage because the law denied the possibility, but my father gathered the household, read scripture, and announced that Josiah was henceforth charged with my care and protection. He would speak with my father's authority regarding my needs. A room was prepared for him beside mine, connected by an interior door but separate enough to preserve appearances. His belongings fit into one small chest, a few garments, some tools, and several books hidden beneath folded shirts like contraband treasure. The first weeks were excruciating in their awkwardness. We were strangers forced into intimacy without the natural unfolding that usually precedes trust. He had spent his life performing heavy labor under coercion. I had spent mine dependent upon servants for tasks that humiliated me more each year. Now he was the one helping me dress, lift, transfer, settle, reach, turn, move. There is no dignified way to learn dependence before a near stranger, and yet somehow he gave me back more dignity with his hands than the whole of society had managed to give me with its manners. He always asked first, "May I?" That small question became sacred to me. In a world where everyone assumed authority over my body, he asked permission. He looked away whenever modesty required it, but never with disgust. He moved carefully, but never theatrically. He did not handle me like fragile glass or unwanted cargo. He handled me like a woman whose comfort mattered. One morning, while helping arrange my bookshelves, he said, "I know this is hard." "You did not choose it either," I replied. He knelt back on his heels and looked at me with a kind of quiet seriousness. "Miss Elellanar, hard is being whipped for another man's anger. Hard is having your mother sold away and never seeing her again. Hard is being treated like a beast while knowing you are not one. This," he glanced around the room, "this is not hard. Strange, yes, but not hard." I did not know what to say. So much of my pain had felt all-consuming because it was all I knew. His life put mine into a different kind of perspective, not smaller, not less real, but differently framed. We were both caged. The bars were simply made of different metal. That spring we developed routines. Mornings he helped me prepare for the day and carried me where the chair could not go. Then he returned to the forge. I managed household accounts, read, embroidered when I wished to appear conventional, and thought far more about him than I admitted. Afternoons, if my father was occupied elsewhere, I would have my chair wheeled to the edge of the forge and watch him work. There is something mesmerizing about a man who knows his craft completely. The heat from the forge rippled the air, sparks flew like angry stars, iron glowed orange then yellow, and in the middle of all that fire stood Josiah, calm and exact, bringing force and finesse together with astonishing control. He did not beat metal randomly, he listened to it. He understood when to strike and when to wait. He could make a hinge, a horseshoe, a railing, a decorative curl of vine from what looked to me like impossible rawness. Watching him, I began to think perhaps the soul could be worked the same way, heated by suffering, shaped by hands, made useful without losing beauty. One afternoon, I surprised us both by asking, could I try? He stared at me. Try what? The forge. He almost laughed, not mockingly, but out of sheer disbelief. Elellanar, it's dangerous. So is living half a life. That silenced him. Within the hour, he had devised a way. He brought my chair close enough to the anvil for me to reach. He heated a small piece of iron, laid it before me, and handed me a lighter hammer. Here, he said, strike there. My first blow was pitiful, the second was less so. By the 10th, my shoulders burned and sweat dampened my collar, but something wild and glorious surged through me. I was doing something, not sitting prettily, not receiving care, not being endured, doing, making, altering the world with my own strength. When the metal cooled, it was only a bent little thing, hardly useful at all, but he held it up and smiled as if I had forged a crown. You made that, he said. No one had ever spoken to me with such simple pride. From then on, the forge became part of my life. Not every day, not always for long, but enough. He taught me how heat changed iron, how timing mattered, how control could matter more than brute force. I made hooks at first, then nails, then small decorative leaves and handles. My arms grew stronger, my confidence changed shape. For the first time since childhood, I no longer felt severed from the physical world. My legs did not work, but my hands did, my mind did, my will did. And meanwhile, something far more dangerous was happening between us. It did not arrive like lightning, it arrived like dawn, so gradually that by the time I recognized it, the world had already changed color. We spent evenings in the library. He read aloud, slowly at first, then with increasing fluency. Poetry suited him. Keats in his voice sounded like something discovered rather than recited. Sometimes I corrected pronunciation and he would grin in mock offense. Sometimes he challenged my interpretations of novels so fiercely I forgot for whole stretches of time that outside those walls existed a world determined to place us on opposite sides of every moral boundary. He told me about his childhood on another plantation, about his mother's songs, about a brother he had not seen in years, about learning to make himself useful so thoroughly that men stopped imagining he had an interior life. I told him about my loneliness, about the humiliation of being displayed before suitors who measured me like livestock, about all the years I had felt myself disappearing beneath everybody else's assumptions. One June evening, he was reading Keats by lamplight. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that seems to invite honesty. I asked him, "What is the most beautiful thing you have ever seen?" He lowered the book. "You yesterday," he said, "at the forge." I could not breathe for a moment. He looked alarmed, as though he had overstepped. "I'm sorry." "Don't be." He set the book aside, but he still looked troubled. "You were laughing," he said softly. "You had soot on your cheek, your hair had come loose, you were stronger than you knew, I thought." He stopped. "I thought that if beauty means anything, it must mean that." No man had ever called me beautiful and made me believe him. Many had avoided the word entirely, as if kindness required only omission. Yet from him it did not sound like consolation, it sounded like recognition. "Do you see me?" I asked. His eyes held mine. "Yes." "And what do you see?" He answered so quietly I almost missed it. "Everything." That was the moment my defenses failed. I told him I thought I was falling in love with him. The words hung in the air between us like a match held near dry paper. He stood so suddenly his chair scraped the floor. "You mustn't say that." "Why?" "Because it's dangerous, because if anyone heard, because if your father knew, because if anybody believed." I asked why I mustn't say it, I said, not why the world would hate it. He closed his eyes. When he opened them again, there was grief in them, and longing, and something like surrender. I have loved you, he said, since the day you asked me about Shakespeare and listened as if my thoughts were worth hearing. I think my heart knew before my mind did, knew before my body did, knew before society's voice could rise up and say impossible. I reached for him. He crossed the room slowly as though approaching a holy place. When he knelt beside my chair, I touched his face for the first time. Warm skin, coarse beard, trembling restraint. Then he kissed me. I had imagined first kisses before in those lonely, foolish ways girls do. I had imagined elegance, youth, perhaps some polished gentleman murmuring flattering nonsense. Nothing I imagined prepared me for the truth. His kiss was careful, reverent, almost frightened, not possession, not conquest. Wonder, I felt seen from the inside outward. For one glorious, terrifying moment, I was not burden, defect, daughter, problem, arrangement, or pity. I was a woman in the arms of the man she loved. We should have stopped there. Of course we should have. But joy has its own recklessness when people have been denied it too long. For months we lived inside a private miracle. We were careful in public, always careful. Before others he remained attentive and respectful, and I remained composed. But in private we became what we truly were, two lonely people who had found home in one another. He would sit on the floor with his back against my chair and read. I would rest my hand in his hair while he discussed passages with infuriating confidence. He carved me small pieces of ironwork from the forge, flowers, leaves, a tiny bird. I embroidered initials onto one of his shirts. He laughed like he had never expected such a thing to belong to him. We talked about futures that could not exist, or so we thought. What would freedom feel like? What city might tolerate us if any existed? Could children inherit joy from parents who had known so little of it? Did God condemn love that crossed the lines men drew, or only the cruelty of those lines themselves? In those months we also crossed into the fullness of intimacy. I will not strip that part of my life bare for spectacle. Some things remain holy because they are not shouted. I will say this, no woman ever felt more cherished than I did in his care. He approached me as he did everything else, with patience, gentleness, and a kind of awe that healed wounds no physician had ever named. I became happier than I knew a human being could be. And happiness, when forbidden, always attracts danger. It happened in December. We were in the library, too lost in one another to hear the footsteps in the hallway. My father opened the door and found us kissing. The sound he made was not loud. That made it worse. Elellanar. We sprang apart. Josiah dropped at once to his knees, all the old training returning in one brutal instant. The room filled with fear so swiftly it was hard to breathe. My father's face had changed into something I had never seen before. Anger, yes, but beneath it shock, confusion, and something like personal betrayal. "You are in love with him," he said. "Not a question." Josiah tried to speak. My father silenced him without looking. I had one chance in that moment to save myself, to say he forced me, to say I was confused, to say anything that would have aligned the situation with what white society would expect. Had I done so, they would have punished him and preserved me. I did not hesitate. "Yes," I said, "I love him, and he loves me. And before you accuse him, know this was mutual. I pursued him as much as he pursued me." My father dismissed him to his room and remained behind with me. What followed was the fiercest conversation of my life. He spoke of scandal, destruction, ruin. He spoke of the world's cruelty. He spoke of my vulnerability, of law, of race, of danger. I spoke of love, of dignity, of all the ways his carefully arranged solution had done more than protect me. It had allowed me to become alive. "You put us together," I said. "Did you think I would not see him? Did you think he would not see me?" "I wanted you safe," he said. "I am safe, safer than I have ever been." "You are in love with a slave." "No," I said, "I am in love with a man." That sentence cost him something to hear. I saw it land, saw all the inherited beliefs in him rise up and fight with what he had observed over the last months. He had seen my happiness. He had seen Josiah's devotion. He had seen me come back to life. Facts and prejudice were at war inside him. At last he said something that chilled me. I could sell him. The room tilted. He raised a hand as I began to plead. I could. That is what any man in my position would do. I think I stopped breathing entirely. "But I won't." He sank into a chair and covered his face with one hand. "Because I have eyes. because I have watched you these past months, because I know what he has become to you, and because, whether I understand it or not, I know he loves you. My father asked for time. Those 2 months that followed nearly broke me. We were not forbidden from seeing each other, but the house changed around us. It was as though every hour waited for a verdict. My father met with lawyers, wrote letters, spent evenings in his study with decanters and documents. Josiah and I moved through our routines with the tenderness of people standing on thin ice. Sometimes at night I heard him pacing in the next room. Sometimes I lay awake imagining every possible future and finding terror in all of them. Then, in late February of 1857, my father called us both into his study. His decision altered the course of our lives. "There is no way to make this work in Virginia," he said. "Not for long, not safely." My heart sank so quickly it hurt. Then he continued, "So I am not going to try." We said nothing, we could not. "I am going to free Josiah. Legally, properly. I am going to provide funds enough for you both to establish yourselves in Philadelphia. I have written to contacts there, abolitionists, lawyers, ministers, people who can help you begin again, and I am arranging for a legal marriage before you leave." I have no words equal to what I felt in that moment. Relief can be so overwhelming it resembles grief, because the body does not know where to place such sudden mercy. Josiah made a sound like a man dragged from underwater. My father looked at him directly. "You have protected my daughter better than any white gentleman who courted her ever would have. You have given her back her spirit. In return, I am giving you the only thing worthy of that service, your freedom." Then he turned to me. "This path will cost you your place in society, perhaps your family name in the eyes of many. It will not be easy, but if you are certain, I will not stand in your way." "I am certain," I said. Josiah's voice broke when he spoke. "Sir, I will spend the rest of my life earning this." My father shook his head. "Love her, that will be enough. If you're still here, leave a comment and tell me whether you think my father was brave, desperate, or both. Because some decisions arrive wrapped in contradiction, and yet they change generations." The next weeks passed in a rush of arrangements. Papers were drawn, signatures were secured, witnesses found. A minister in Richmond, sympathetic and discreet, agreed to marry us under circumstances he likely knew were dangerous. My wedding was not grand, no orchestra played, no row of polished ladies dabbed at tears, no white roses lined the aisle, but I remember it as the most beautiful ceremony I ever saw. The church was small and cold. Morning light spilled through narrow windows. My father stood beside me. Josiah wore his best coat, still too small across his shoulders no matter how the tailor tried. My dress was simple ivory with lace at the collar. I was wheeled forward because I could not walk, and for once I did not feel ashamed of that fact. I was not being displayed as damaged. I was arriving as beloved. When the minister asked whether I took this man, I answered before he had finished the sentence. When Josiah said my name in his vows, his voice trembled so badly I nearly wept before my turn came. "We chose the surname Freeman. There are names you inherit and names you earn. That day he earned his, and I chose mine." We left Virginia on March 15, 1857, 2 trunks, books, tools, clothing, papers that meant more than any jewelry ever could. My father embraced me before we departed, and though he tried to remain composed, I felt his shoulders shake. "Write to me," he said. "I will. Be happy, Elellanar. I am already happier than I thought possible." Then he took Josiah's hand. 2 men from opposite sides of a monstrous system, bound at last by the same woman and by some hard, imperfect effort toward decency. "With my life," Josiah said when my father told him to protect me. And that was not a dramatic promise, it was merely truth. The journey north felt unreal. Every mile seemed stolen, every checkpoint made my pulse race. Though the freedom papers were legitimate, fear does not vanish because law briefly aligns with mercy. Josiah kept expecting to be challenged, accused, seized. I kept expecting some messenger from Virginia to arrive with a reversal, but no one stopped us, no one tore up the documents, no one dragged him away. When we crossed into Pennsylvania, Josiah looked out at the road for a very long time and said, almost to himself, "I am free." People think freedom begins with celebration. Sometimes it begins with disbelief. Philadelphia in 1857 was noisier and harsher than any place I had ever lived, but it was also more alive. The streets bustled, carts rattled, bells rang, languages and accents crossed one another in the markets. There were free black families, immigrants, laborers, businessmen, abolitionists, hypocrites, saints, and ordinary people too busy surviving to care much who loved whom. Prejudice existed, certainly, often openly, but there was room to breathe, room to become. With the help of my father's contacts, we found modest lodging and later secured a space for a forge. Josiah opened Freeman's forge with careful ambition. He worked dawn to dusk as he always had, but now the labor belonged to him. The first time he hung the sign bearing his own name, I watched his hands tremble, not from weakness, from the unbearable tenderness of ownership over one's own labor at last. I managed the books, negotiated prices, tracked deliveries, corresponded with customers. The education that had once been considered ornamental in a disabled daughter became one of the engines of our survival. We were good together in business because we were good together everywhere else. Where he saw function, I saw structure. Where he saw craft, I saw pattern. We argued, laughed, revised, planned. By the end of our first year, Freeman's forge was prospering. And then our son was born. His name was Thomas. When the doctor placed him in my arms, I looked first at his tiny mouth, then at his hands, then at Josiah. My husband stood frozen beside the bed like a man who had been told to cradle a star and feared he might destroy it. When he finally took our son, the expression on his face was unlike anything I had ever seen. Terror, awe, gratitude, and love so pure it nearly hurt to witness. The world had said I would not bear children. The world had said he was unfit for tenderness. The world, as usual, was wrong. More children followed in the years ahead. William, Margaret, James, Elizabeth. Our home grew noisier, fuller, more chaotic, more blessed. Josiah built cradles for each of them. I read to them in the evenings. He sang low old songs from his mother's memory when they were ill. We raised them to know the truth of their origins, not as shame, but as inheritance. Their father had been enslaved. Their mother had been cast aside. Their existence was a rebellion against every system that had tried to define worth by hierarchy. Did the world welcome us? No, not fully. Some neighbors kept distance. Certain customers refused service once they learned enough. There were whispers, there were insults, there were churches where we were stared at and streets where children repeated their parents' cruelty. But there were also friendships, shared meals, allies, communities of free black families, abolitionist circles, working households, and women whose own griefs made them gentler to mine. We were not universally embraced, but we were real. We belonged to ourselves, and that made all the difference. One of the great unexpected gifts of our life together came years later, when Josiah began designing a device for my legs. He had watched me long enough to understand what many doctors never had, that my body's limits were not identical to the limits they assigned me. He studied metal, hinges, braces, leather straps, weight distribution. He experimented in secret for months. Then one day he brought me a set of supports unlike anything I had seen. "With your permission," he said, smiling that quiet smile that still undid me after all those years, "I'd like to try something." The braces attached along my legs and up to a support at my waist. With crutches and his steady hands beside me, I pushed upward. The first attempt failed. The second lasted a heartbeat longer. The third, I stood. Not gracefully, not for long, not without effort, but I stood. The room blurred through tears. He looked as though he had witnessed resurrection. Then, with shaking arms and every muscle in revolt, I took a step. And another. Awkward, painful, real. After nearly 2 decades in that chair, I walked across our parlor with my husband beside me, the children watching from the doorway in stunned silence. When I finally collapsed back into the chair laughing and sobbing all at once, Josiah knelt and kissed my hands. "You always carried me," I told him. He shook his head. "No, we carried each other." That is the truth no one teaches young people. Real love is not rescue in one direction, it is mutual deliverance. Our children grew. Thomas became a physician. William trained in law. Margaret taught school. James developed a mind for mechanics and structures. Elizabeth loved words most of all and inherited the dangerous family habit of observation. Each of them took some quality from each of us and turned it into a life larger than either parent could have imagined. When I watched them at table, laughing, debating, reaching for bread, interrupting one another, I often had to remind myself that there had once been a time I believed I would die alone in a room where no one wanted me. My father visited twice over the years. The first time he stepped into our Philadelphia home with visible uncertainty, as though he did not know whether what he had helped create would resemble scandal or peace. By the end of that week, he had Thomas in his lap and Margaret tugging at his sleeve and Josiah discussing shop expansion with him over supper as if such scenes had always been possible. I saw him watching us when he thought no one noticed, not proudly exactly, more humbly than that. as if he had stumbled through desperation into one correct thing. When he died in 1870, I grieved him honestly. Our relationship had not been simple. How could it be? He had participated in the systems that wounded us even as he tried in the end to free us from some of their consequences. But people are rarely only one thing. He left me a letter. In it he wrote that giving me to Josiah had begun as a practical act and ended as the wisest decision of his life. He said he had mistaken society's blindness for truth. He said Josiah had seen me more clearly than any man of my class ever had. I wept over that letter until the paper softened in my hands. The years passed, businesses changed, the nation convulsed, war came and went. Slavery ended in law after it had already ended in our household by choice and courage. We grew older, his beard silvered, my hands stiffened. The children married, grandchildren arrived. The forge passed into younger hands, though Josiah could never resist wandering in to correct something or admire a line of metalwork. We learned the strange sweetness of old age. Not passion diminished, but passion deepened into habit, trust, memory, humor, and 1,000 small fidelities. Even in old age, he never entered a room without first seeing where I was. Even in old age, I still slept better if I could hear him breathe. Sometimes on winter evenings, he would read to me in that same deep voice that had once carried Shakespeare through my father's library. Sometimes he would stop halfway through a page because he had grown emotional at some sentence about devotion or loss, and I would pretend not to notice until he smiled again. We had endured enough hardship that joy no longer needed to prove itself with grandeur. It lived in tea, in quiet, in repaired shawls. In his hand resting over mine, as if it had been built for that place. When pneumonia took me in March of 1895, I knew before anyone said it that my time was near. Illness has a way of clarifying the body's farewell. The children gathered, the room stayed dim, my breath shortened, and beside me, as he had been beside me through every chapter of my life that mattered, was Josiah. I told him thank you. Not because thank you could contain what he had given me, nothing could, but because gratitude was the truest final language I had. Thank you for seeing me, I said. Thank you for loving me. Thank you for making me believe I was never broken. He held my hand against his cheek. When I was gone, the doctor said his heart stopped the next day. Some people will call that romance and smile, but those who have lived long enough know there is another word for it: completion. We had become so much a part of one another's daily breath that separation lasted only hours. And if this story has moved you, subscribe, like, and comment now. Not for me alone. For every person ever told they were too damaged to be loved, too different to belong, too inconvenient to deserve tenderness. Stories like ours must be kept alive because the world forgets too easily what labels can do to human beings. We were buried together. Our children carried us into memory. Elizabeth later wrote our story so that time would not erase it. People called it remarkable, defiant, impossible. I understand why, but from inside it did not feel impossible. It felt inevitable once the truth had been allowed room to breathe. Two people condemned by society for different reasons recognized each other's humanity and built a life upon that recognition. That is all, and yet that is everything. So when people ask me across the years what changed my life, I could say many things. I could say the accident, the wheelchair, the rejections, my father's decision, Philadelphia, freedom papers, marriage, children, all of those would be true, but the deepest truth is simpler. My life changed the day one man looked at me and saw not what was missing, but what was there. And perhaps that is what all of us are waiting for in one form or another. Not rescue, not perfection, not even ease, just to be seen accurately and loved anyway. Before I end, let me leave you with this. Society called me unmarriageable because my legs did not work. Society called him brute because his body frightened people and because racism requires lies to survive. Society called our love unnatural because it crossed lines built to preserve power, not truth. Society was wrong on every count. I was never unworthy. He was never less than human. And our love was never the scandal. The scandal was the world that tried to keep us apart. If you believe people are more than the labels forced onto them, leave a comment below. If you believe love can grow in impossible places, press like. And if you want more stories that break open everything the world told us to accept, subscribe and stay with me. Because I was 22 years old in Virginia when they told me I would die alone. And instead, I met Josiah Freeman. They called him the Brute. He was the gentlest man I ever knew.